kind of monolithic too. It covers a whole lot of material for 70 years of culture. So yeah, you get these big chapters. So calling this thing a juggernaut, right? Like it's a mammoth, powerful force. But it didn't start that way. In fact, the American Industrial Society didn't really begin until after the influence of the Brits. So what happens is the British start the Industrial Revolution. There's no doubt about that. I teach that in World II. The British factory creators were there. And America was sort of slow to do this. And I guess the reason is, now the ideas do ultimately come over from Britain, Belgium, the Germanys. But initially, one of the reasons why is that we didn't have that many workers. Keep in mind, over 90% of the American public were rural, right? So it wasn't like they were concentrated around cities. So really scarcity of labor. And this is, a lot of times my PowerPoints are just sort of supplements to what's in your textbook. I tried to anyway. But we, honestly, we didn't really need to do it much, right? And the British were quite good at it. Now, another reason that there was scarce labor, and you definitely should put this down, I think, is that tons of Americans had land. That's not the case in Europe. So if you had tons of land, you really don't need to go to work inside a factory building. If you know anything about that, that's quite difficult work. So that was why labor was so scarce, is that people were owning businesses. Secondly, throughout the early stages of American history, very little capital. Capital is money used for investment, right? Money from someone that you can borrow. Well, there wasn't that much capital, and what capital there was mostly tied up in shipping, right? Like the rich people in America were either large-scale plantation owners or merchants who shipped goods on boats. Okay? Another one which seems odd, knowing America, and it's not up here, but we didn't know about the raw materials we had. We didn't know America was literally the Middle East of coal, which it is. We're the Saudi Arabia of coal. All right. They didn't know about that. They didn't know about their own iron ore. And lastly, on that list, the Brits had a dominant monopoly already that they created. And it was, it would be like trying to open up a business that sells the same stuff that is sold at Walmart. You're going to have a really hard time competing with Walmart's economy of scale. Massive supply chain, huge warehouses, massive store. Well, the Brits were already doing that on a massive scale. I might also add just another something you might want to write down. Jefferson and Madison's antipathy to it. There was no government at all encouragement of factory development. Hamilton had tried. Hamilton had considered, hey, let's make factories. But with Jefferson and Madison disliking, and Monroe, disliking factories, it's going to need a Kickstarter that they didn't want to provide. Now, there are two Kickstarters that we've covered. What two events in history are going to lay the foundation for America to be able to do this? What two things are going to create a different environment for factory success? Well, immigration is going to start coming. I kind of wonder if that's the field of dreams kind of thing. Like if you build it, they will come. I think really that's not the initial answer, because the first factory workers weren't immigrants. But they do come later, and that's certainly the growth of the industry. How about the Embargo Act? The Embargo Act meant you couldn't buy foreign stuff, right? Couldn't ship your stuff. That meant if you're going to have stuff in America, where did it need to come from? America. So the Embargo Act was an unintentional but realistic, kind of Kickstarter to industrial development. The other one is along the same lines. The world's greatest textile seller, the workshop of the world, they called themselves, was Britain. Well, what did we do in 1812? We fought a war with Britain, which means, are we going to be buying stuff from Britain when they're attacking our merchant vessels? And yeah, so between the Embargo Act and the War of 1812, thirdly, the encouragement by Congress under Henry Clay, you guys recall something called the American system? attitudes began to shift towards the success of factories. So in other words, it wasn't like Jefferson and Madison intended for the Industrial Revolution to work, but because of our policies, these were unintended consequences. Now, this is the man that Andrew Jackson called, literally, when he met him, called the father of the factory system. Now, he's not the father of the factory system in the world, all right, but he is the father of the American factory system. His name is Samuel Slater. Notice the date. Very close to the end of the 18th century. He is a British trader, a British traitor, as in like, as a young man, he is going to commit to memory how to build a mill, all the machinery, where to put it. He is literally going to steal this idea from Britain. So when we think about copyrights and patent laws, the American people, factory-wise, started out stealing patent laws, stealing copyright. Chinese are doing it now to us a lot. But hey, you know, he was a British immigrant, and in Rhode Island, not far from Quahog, they built the very first textile mill. Now that's on a, can you see it? It's on a waterfall, right, like running water. In New England, this is why New England's going to be home to so many factories, among other reasons. In New England, you have swift rivers that go down waterfalls. What's really great to put on that? Yeah, a water, it's not a turbine yet, because they don't do electricity, but you get the idea of a manual turner. Yeah, something, it's a series of gears that turn by water power. It's a water wheel, right? So these are water-wheeled towered mills. And the first factories are textile mills. Now, in 1793, they're making primarily woolen goods. But within a decade, literally, they're going to shift to making what? Cotton goods. So we'll talk about that shift in a minute. So his mill is called the Slatersville Mill. And he becomes the first model for other factories, creators, innovators to copy. Keep in mind, his idea is literally a stolen British mill. All right. But one of the great things about American entrepreneurs is we're going to take what the British do and we're going to innovate and improve on it. So very quickly, we're going to make these our own. And there's going to be a real competition between, and again, look at the date, 1793. Well, within 10 years, you're going to have the embargo or so. In 20 years, you've got the War of 1812. So demand for this, and I know we take for granted, what can we get cheaply in America today? Really cheaply? Well, a lot, right? But textiles, right? We don't think about, why do textiles, almost any textiles cost money? Expensive ones.
Because they use like expensive products.
Do they? Expensive materials? No, unless they're like putting gold or something I'm not aware of. That sweatshirt you're wearing is made out of the same material as your jeans. It's cotton. All what y'all are wearing is cotton. I'm wearing some sort of polymer blend, but it's still cheap relatively. Why is everything not cost cheap? You're paying for what? No, a logo. That's all you're doing. You're paying for some brand, Columbia or Under Armour, Converse. You understand? Vans. They're made in the exact same place as the foot burners and the no label stuff, right? You know, you're not really, I mean, Carhartt's made in China now. Quality goes down, you know? So cheap textiles was enormous, people. It was like a big freaking deal to be able to afford clothing. Because before this, people, handmade. That's how clothes were, handmade. It was expensive, you know, and rare. So we will associate inventiveness in America for much. Now, today, when we think about inventiveness, we think about like Silicon Valley, you know, like California. We think about what's the time on my phone? It's set to Apple headquarters. What's the town in Washington?
Cupertino.
Cupertino, yeah, like Cupertino time. You know, that's it, Apple time. You know, so in other words, the left coast, the West Coast brilliance, so to speak. You're going to go into technology like that. But through this period of history, it's New England. So you will hear the phrase Yankee ingenuity, Yankee ingeniousness, Yankee inventiveness a lot. And they are talking about like New England. Mark Twain will write a book during this period called A Connecticut Yankee. in King Arthur's court. And it's a time travel story about a guy who can invent factories and telegraph wires in medieval King Arthur's time. You know, Mark Twain writes it. So it's a pretty cool book. So Yankee invented this. You give me, and Americans, and that's what I love about America. I hate that so many of my students are so reluctant to try things. America's brilliance is on the freedom to fail. Most successful businesses have failed 3 times before they succeed on the 4th. That per cap like ratio, right? Willing to try anything. First, we did what? First imitate, then innovate. And that's why we teach you guys. You imitate, then you innovate. That's the idea. You operate without a net. You become successful and genius. Make cool stuff for me to have. All right? So thousands and thousands of patents are coming down. And this is the part of our culture which we need to celebrate and embrace. I mean, better than anybody else. America leads the world at this, you know, inventing stuff. That's why we're so freaking cool. If we act like freaking automatons, then we're not going to invent stuff. You guys are being produced to be great test takers. Well, there's no real career in test taking. You know, I want y'all to operate where you know, think and have risks and have difficulty and overcome adversity. That's what these people do. Okay? Now, by far the most influential figure after Slater is Eli Whitney. Now, Eli Whitney is another New Englander. I think he's New Hampshire. And he's going to be known for 2 developments. Now, his first development is obvious. His first development is the cotton gin. Now, it was such an easy machine. It stands for engine. He's down in, I think it was Kentucky. He sees a simple machine being operated, I think, by 2 slaves. And it's basically just a box with cones in it, you know? And he's like, hey, I could do that, but better. Goes back up north, builds one. You're looking at it, right? What this does is it takes the production of cotton lint. Lint is the short staple cotton, which is the kind of cotton that grows like away from the ocean, is got the sticky seeds in it that are hard to pick out. So if you want to turn cotton into lint that you can use to make goods with, you know, make fiber out of, it takes hours and hours and hours to hand pick the cotton out. So we would say in industry terms, your return on investment would not be very good. Well, this eliminates that. And now one person can pick, well, not pick, but produce hundreds and hundreds of pounds of cotton, bales of cotton. And so this becomes known as the cotton gin. Well, guys, this thing is so easy to make that hundreds of competitors make knockoff versions of it. In other words, Whitney patents it, and then immediately his patent is stolen by everybody else. It's one of the ironies of him kind of maybe stealing it from them, is that he spends most of his career trying to sue the people who have copied this patent. All right, but it's an easy device, and it spreads everywhere. It moves all over the South. You see it into the brand new area we're moving into, places like Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi. This is where people are moving westward. Remember Cherokee versus Georgia? Well, they're moving west in here, right? So much more effective. Notice the year. 1793, right? Same year that Slater opens his factory. So within a decade, cotton gins are everywhere. You mind, a lot of them aren't actually whose cotton gin. That's why they look different when you go look at them. Like that one looks there, and then that one looks different, right? So they're knockoffs. They're just a bunch of knockoffs. But do they all work? So the obvious impact of this is it will now mean an enormous amount of cotton textiles for the mills. Now you're going to have demand for labor, way more demand for labor, right? So the mills are going to have a flood of this material. The problem, of course, which Eli Whitney had no intent to do, is it means all these new Deep South states are going to have what? An increase in slavery. And what's so tragic to me about it, 1793 particularly, is that slavery was dying out in America. It was no longer profitable. The folks in Virginia, tobacco had plateaued, okay? And so here was the cost benefit of having slavery. Again, I hate to demoralize the conversation down to that, but the problem with having slaves is they reach sort of an age of no longer being that effective. And you still had to pay for them. You still had to feed them, and because it wasn't legal to just murder your slaves if you didn't like them anymore. You know, they weren't useful anymore. So slaves were becoming a burden to society in places like Virginia. Virginia especially was considering ending slavery. But this transformed slavery, because now what could you use your slaves in Virginia for? Well, that's Georgia and South Carolina and Mississippi, but go with that. It's a repugnant concept, but it was very real. So if you're a Virginian or a North Carolinian or a Kentuckian and Tennessean with a lot of your money invested in slaves, you don't really need the labor that much anymore. You start breeding slaves to sell down the river. So now we start to have, as its own internal industry, slave production to feed the demand for slaves in the Deep South. Now, I do want to make sure you understand, slaves are not used in northern factories. They're not like at machines making textile work. But the northern factories were utterly dependent on slave-financed cotton. So people have this theory that like New Englanders were running around being abolitionists, you know, like they didn't like. They were very aware that what made their machinery run. Slaves picked cotton, and if the slaves didn't pick the cotton, how much would the cotton cost? A lot more. And so they were out of sight, out of mind, but they were not any defenders of the end of slavery. You know, they were very much defenders of the status quo. All right. So I don't want y'all to think like Northerners go, oh, slavery's terrible. You know, they didn't think much at all about it. Cotton is not a profitable. If you're down country, Eastern Virginia, it's mostly peanuts and soybeans. Our soil isn't the type of climate appropriate for that, really. Maybe a little bit in Virginia, but certainly not enough to make it an industry. So you need like humidity. You need like deep south humidity. You know, if you've been to Louisiana, Eastern Texas, you know, where it's like 108 degrees and it ain't a dry heat. You know, like that's where cotton is. South Carolina, though, if you're down near Myrtle Beach, you'll see cotton fields. All right, so and they call that the Cotton Kingdom. I have a map on several other PowerPoints of the Black Belt. That's another name for it, where the largest congregation of African Americans will be in America as the slave sector of where cotton was. I did want to point out, though, that Whitney's really longer, interesting contribution beyond the cotton gin is he develops the beginning of mass industries. He creates his major job. He did this on the side as a tinkerer. His major job was to sell guns, like rifle guns. Prior to this, if you owned a firearm, it was probably handcrafted, which is hard to imagine, but like hand assembled. And he was like, that's not going to be profitable. And so what he creates, and you definitely want to put a star beside it, is the system of what is called interchangeable parts. That means you can manufacture 500 barrels or 500 guns and take all barrels off, you know, mix them up, and they'll fit on any of the other guns. So interchangeable parts. Well, that's the precursor to mass production. So Whitney's a really inventive guy, to say the least. And unfortunately, the slave thing is his lasting negative legacy. But his cotton gin, which was patented, and then mass production, again, you know, the book, I think this book, certainly several books, give an analogy of him taking 10 firearms to a Congress exhibit, taking all 10 guns apart, reassembling them and firing each one of them. Which means you don't, in the past, if you broke a trigger, let's say it's terrible, a hammer on a firearm, you had to have it hand cast by a metalsmith, which meant it would take forever and it was expensive. Now, just literally a series of parts. That's all it was. Okay, so no interchangeable parts. There's his gun factory. Another two inventors you should be aware of. Now, they didn't actually invent the sewing machine, but the Singer sewing machine is the product of Isaac Singer. Now, Howe and Singer work together. If you go to your grandma's house or you ask your mom about your grandma, she probably has somewhere in the corner a Singer sewing machine. Today, they kind of look like, you're nodding your head, Gabe. Yeah, they kind of look like artifacts now, you know, but these were so prolific. And the earliest factories would have like hundreds and hundreds of these lined up in rows. Okay, and they would be sewing cloth together. Okay, so the Singer sewing machine, another major fuel for ready-made clothing. Keep in mind, all these early industries are textile in nature. Not all of them, mostly textile. Women are going to shift into this area more dramatically. They're already so enclosed in what was called the cottage industry. I had the misfortunate nickname of the putting out system. It's like, can you imagine saying, yeah, my sister and mom put out last night? It would sound weird, wouldn't it? Putting out, but that's what the domestic system, the cottage, it means they created 2 shirts or a sleeve. You know, they put out pieces of it. Now, all of it being done in one location. Singer sewing machine. So another element of early 20th century, I do want to make sure, and I have a video on this too, if you want to watch it on my YouTube links, but the American governmental attitude towards business was not only laissez-faire, it certainly was laissez-faire, i.e. there were no government really like regulations at all. There were no corporate taxes. There was no, our understanding of the government and business would be so far removed from then to now. But initially, when you wanted to create a business, you had to seek out a charter. A charter was something the legislature of Virginia, for example, would pass, like a law, basically, giving you that business. But after the 1840s, you have what's called the principle of free incorporation, meaning you can file for a corporate charter with a business, what do you call it? Like, basically, it was just a simple bureaucrat, like a licensing association from the government, a licensing firm. And that was it. You didn't have to get Congress or the General Assembly of Virginia to authorize your business. If you can imagine, that's a political harangue. So now you can get a business operator's license and create a corporation. Now, free incorporation means, you know, you have the right to assemble shares of investors. This is the beauty of capitalism that's going to be furthered by what's called an LLC. I hope some of you had marketing or business and have learned what an LLC is. But one of the major changes that occurred is in America, not only did you have a right to just create a business, basically, free incorporation, okay, but the firm owner had the right to not put himself at risk beyond the money that they put in. So if you've got 20 investors and each of your 20 investors puts $1,000, they don't risk any more than $1,000. So if the business, let's say you build a factory, it costs $20,000. Each investor put in $1,000. It's got 100 workers, and a fire breaks out and burns up 40 of them. You can't be sued for more than $1,000 because it's only the corporation. In other words, this makes a corporation an individual separate from the people who put their money in. So, like if, for example, I'm thinking that instead of owning rental property in my name, like here in Pennsylvania County, instead of having like rental property sole proprietor me and a buddy of mine who do home improvements will make an LLC, and thus if anything happens in that rental property, they can't take anything more than the business. What's invested in the business. I assume your folks have that. Limited liability, which means they can't sue you for your house. They can't sue you for your kids' college tuition. They can only sue, liability means sue, right, for the amount of money invested in the business by the individual investor. Still true today. LLCs, yeah, it's the way we do business still. And we're the guys that started it, you know, like 200 years ago. So the LLC is the most common way of business ownership, either for corporation or for even a single individual can create an LLC, you know, so that you yourself are not liable. It's the company that's liable. And that makes sense. Unless there's like malfeasance, like you break a law, then you might be responsible, you know, but typically it's a way to shelter the investor from more danger than what he's put into. She's put it. Okay, so these are laws: free incorporation, limited liability. The court routinely upheld contract rights. Remember Dartmouth v. Woodward, Fletcher v. Peck. Supreme Court consistently upheld contract law. Okay, so this was a very pro-business, laissez-faire environment, if that makes sense. They weren't nearly as corporatist today as our government is, crony capitalists, I think, sometimes. But the government did give a thumbs up to business. And we'll talk about other ways that happened. Now, other inventors of the period. You are familiar with Samuel Morse, his brilliant invention. Morse was looking for a way to accomplish what he did, and that was to communicate over distance. These are telegraph lines. Telegraph lines are brittle and stiff, but they do run on elevated poles. They look like what? Like telephone poles. So when the telephone comes along, guess where they'll put the telephone lines? In fact, Alexander Graham Bell will buy out a position of Samuel Morse with another guy named J.P. Morgan. Morgan and Bell will create, using the existing Morse lines, the American Telegraph and Telephone Company. Let that sink in. The American Telegraph and Telephone Company. What did Bell invent or create? AT&T. American, right? So they're going to build on existing telegraph lines. Now, this is Morse's invention. He did very well by this. This is his singular also development. This is Morse code, something that's been, very much a part of Western society until about 10, 20 years ago. The very first line ever texted, if you want to say that, ever telegraphed out was, "What hath God wrought?" Now I've got a question mark here, but it shouldn't be a question mark. It's an exclamation point. It's not "What hath God wrought?" It's "What hath God wrought?" It's quoting the Bible. It's actually his girlfriend's daughter recommended him write this. "Surely there is no enchantment against Jacob or any divination against Israel," like reading the future. "According to this time, it should be said of Jacob and Israel." They see the future, right? There's no enchantment. They see the future. Look at what God wrought, right? Look at what God has done. We're awesome. So it's not a question mark. It's a statement. What has God wrought? We're awesome, man. What have we done? Good stuff. So the Morse code, telegram. Well, if you got a telegram, you got to lay cable to get places. First of all, telegraphs are on poles. See them? Poles. This guy says, what if we put a telegram to England? And he did. And so he would become one of the great communicate experts of history. This is Cyrus Field. He laid his company. Again, when I say he, a lot of this is like company. His company laid the very first transatlantic cable, which went from America all the way to Ireland, and then from Ireland to England. Now, the first time they set it down, it lasted for about 8 hours, I think, and then it broke. Because it's on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So that's a bit of an effort. But they pull up the part and fixed it. And it's to this day, this will be a way to communicate, not telegraph anymore, but now we have satellites and all that good stuff. But we do have instant communication. And so he's making the world a shorter place. Okay. Now, life was good for these folks. Life was good for the middle class people who benefited from this stuff. Life was not so good for these folks. The factory worker. So who were the factory worker? Well, the bulk of the factory workers, 70%, were women and children. A woman would be paid 1/2 of an adult male. A child would be paid 1/4 of an adult male. Labor wages, okay? A child in America, on average, would work a 14-hour day, 6 days a week. They were required to have 2 hours of education per day. You can get 2 hours of schooling and 14 hours of factory work or coal mining. Okay? There were no such thing as overtime, no such thing as workman's compensation, no such thing as disability, no such thing as OSHA, no such thing as air conditioning or heat. So brutal, difficult work. Brutal labor.
How much was it for children?
1/4. Yeah. And half of all factory workers in the beginning were under the age of 10. They're like my 9-year-old. And they look like this. Yeah. So, when we talk about child labor, I can show you tons of pictures of child labor. We didn't really end child labor until the New Deal. My granddaddy dropped out of schooling when he was 13 because when you were in my granddaddy's generation, which is the generation before the Great Depression, only people who went to 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade were college-bound students. High school was not something for most kids. So 8th grade was when school stopped. Well, even before that, most kids dropped out even before to work in a mill. This is textile mill work, which our mill here in Danville had child labor. Okay, so that like I said, half were under the age of 10. So you're talking about, like, their little fingers would work really well on these spindles. It's called bobbin doffers. They go in there and they unjam them. The kids would be tired, and so they had a room in the factory called a dunking room where you would take a kid and hold their head underwater. Oh, totally. They had guys that would whip them, not beat them like mercilessly, but keep them at work. Overseers, basically. That's what the adult man's job was typically. Women did this stuff too. No labor unions, no rights. So purely, at the mercy of your employer. If you want to know what free capitalism looks like, that's it. This is what no regulations capitalism looks like. You understand? Because keep in mind, if you go back to who these people were, it is not their concern about patriotism. It is not their concern about worker safety or rights. What is their concern? Profit. It's all they're concerned about, the profit of their corporation. One of the things that bothers me to no end is when people want to analogize Wall Street stock market with the entire economy's success, right? It's great for my investments. It's great for my retirement, but if you're an ordinary American, you don't have a retirement. Ordinary Americans aren't invested in the stock market. Hardly any Americans are per capita. So they're not feeling very good about this, And by the way, when factory jobs begin to attract immigrants, you can imagine life doesn't improve much. Okay? Lots of child labor. So the change begins, let this sink in, the change begins with Jacksonian democracy. Here's the thing. One of those parties, the Democrats, liked the fact that who routinely voted for them. The Democrats work, their coalition, working coalition, farmers and factory workers. Well, if you're a Democratic Party man and factory workers are your voters, do you want to please them? So you start to see more laws passed. Not many, but to limit the workday to 12 and then 10-hour day. No overtime. Just saying 60 hours is the most you're going to work during the week. Maybe better wages, maybe healthier conditions, but I don't want you to go away from this thinking that all of a sudden they were living in the lap of luxury, or all of a sudden they were doing as well as Goodyear workers today. They weren't. But when you had the right to vote, that gave more influence to that class of people. Working class voters were now able to shape public policy to some degree. Then you start to see, with immigrants, as well as work competition, strikes outbreak around the country. But the strikes are wrecked by what event? Yeah, the Great Depression of 37. The Panic of 37, it's really, really hard to demand better wages and working conditions when, 25% of the workforce is out of work. Because you're like, I can fire you, pay the next guy a third of what you make, and he'll work and shut up. So the worst time to be a labor organizer, the worst time to seek better pay and working conditions is when there's a surplus of you, right? And a shortage of money to go around. Right now, across the country, teachers ought to be demanding a whole lot more money. They're quitting like crazy all across the country. Conditions are not that healthy. We don't want to go to work in a situation where we're not in a safe working condition, right? So all across the country, teachers are saying, forget it. I'm old enough to quit. I don't need this hassle. You understand? So when a demand is high for a worker and supply of those workers are low, by the way, that's the other thing. Hardly anybody going into teaching. You guys think, oh, I can't wait to be a teacher. No, nobody does, right? So, well, maybe a third grade teacher, but not a high school teacher. Oh, gosh. Right, so no, you don't want to be a third grade teacher either. That's scary. All right, so I do want to talk about unions a little bit. The very first union in America was founded by a utopian socialist. His name was Robert Owen, and it was called the Working Man's Party. It was not legal. Okay, it was local. New York didn't allow it. And it didn't have very much success. So he's going to adopt a different attitude pretty quickly called socialism. That ain't going to work here either. But hey, utopian socialism was an idea. That's the idea where the business is owned by the workers, not the government, but the workers themselves. We would call this a co-op today. But Not successful, usually illegal. Well, the major change that occurred was when the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, it's always Massachusetts, it's the most liberal. You notice that? I think it's because they've had public education forever. All right, but nonetheless, Massachusetts said, we will allow what? Unions. But that's a state decision, not a national decision. Everybody hear that? Massachusetts was home to a huge number of factories, including the famous Lowell mills. But by and large, unions are utterly ineffective. We're not going to talk much about labor history pre-Civil War. What is it? You know, there's really no labor history to speak of pre-Civil War. Immigration is just too easy to have work. You know, one of the reasons why I was when I managed the food line, I was never concerned about unions in my part of food line, and that was because I ran the front end. And baggers and cashiers, you know, they made like $8 an hour or whatever it was back then. And if they complained or didn't show up to work, I just stopped scheduling them and hired somebody else. Because you guys, as teenagers, are utterly replaceable. You know, you don't have high skills. There's a lot of demand for cheap jobs. So that's how it works. That's capitalism, right? That's why I encourage you not to overinvest your time into some service sector job that you have no intent to be your career. Don't let that drain away what you do intend to do in your future. Not bad to have a little bit of practical experience, but get the idea. So here's a reminder to you about what people who worked in factories were called. People who worked around machinery were called mechanics. Everybody hear that? That's another one of those words that gets lost in the translation. We're not talking about people who repair automobiles. We're talking about people who work in machinery. Journeyman means, you know, move. A journeyman can work for a different company this week or that, or regardless. So they didn't create guilds. You guys know guilds?
Yeah.
But a guild is kind of an idea of a union, right? The journeyman mechanics of Philadelphia are serious of forming an association which will avert the evils of poverty and nonstop work have already inflicted. They're saying poverty and incessant toil. If the masses of people were enabled by their labor to buy for themselves and families and a supply of the comforts and conveniences, their consumption would amount to at least twice what it does at present. Guys, this is one of the leading causes for arguing that people should be paid more. If you pay people more, particularly working class people, they will spend it. You understand? They will buy stuff. Thus, this is the whole reason why you pay people. Now, if your employee works for Boeing in Seattle, they're not going to buy a Boeing, right? But the idea is that by paying people, they'll spend it. If you give rich people more money, guess what they do? They save it. But they're smart. That's why they're rich. They save it. They invest it. You give poor people more money, what do? That's why it funds the economy. You understand? This is the biggest argument for give people more money. Now, the counter argument is that it will lead to inflation, right? Inflation has nothing to do with just the rise of prices. What causes inflation is an increase in the monetary supply. Now, if an employer wants to charge more for their product, that's their call, okay? They usually don't, though, we notice. The consumption would be double. And of course, the demand by which employers are enabled either to subsist or would likewise be increased in the same proportion. You're going to make more money. You pay us more, you'll make more, right? Because more people will buy your stuff. The real object, therefore, of this is to stop the desolating evil which must arise from the depreciation, the decline of value of human labor. One of the biggest criticisms throughout the 19th century is that who are perceived as not being valuable. This is the kind of stuff Marx gets into. The worker themselves. In other words, labor is sort of like, you know, it's just part of the equation. Well, for these guys, what is the equation? Labor. Without labor, you don't have any of the rest, right? It's the intrinsic value of it, okay? So he says to raise mechanical and productive classes to a condition of independence and equality. What do they want? They want to be rich? Is that what you read there? They want twice what they currently have so that they may share in the what? Comfort and convenience of life. When America's blue-collar factory workers arise at the middle class in the 1950s, America wins history. You understand? Because we were on our path to eradicating poverty without using the government, right? But we had to use the government some, because guess where those jobs came from? The government. It's government spending. But the point is, they're saying, if you pay us more, we'll live better lives and we'll spend that money. We'll go out and we'll buy furniture. We'll buy more clothes. We'll buy a wagon, right? The stuff you're selling. It's a fair argument. That's their argument in 1828. Okay?
So, one thing, sure, I was wondering, like, when they paid people more, did prices normally go up?
It depended. Ford didn't later on in history. Ford paid his workers double. They mass-produced Model Ts, and they were not expensive. So I guess the question becomes, do employers absorb the income that is part of their output? So if you're spending more, so you double, is there double consumption, thus you're making more profit? Keep in mind, your profit shouldn't be solely dependent on how much you're paying your workers, right? So, I mean, of course it is. Wages, actually, you know what's more important than wages now for a lot of employers? Benefits. Yeah, that's the most expensive thing companies do now, benefits, really, and wages. Wage and benefit package. The problem is that most employers aren't conceptualizing their employee as a macroeconomic issue. So if you are at Walmart and you pay your employee more, guess what? You don't have to increase prices because they're just going to literally put it right back into Walmart. But if you're in, like, I don't know, a lumber company and you pay them more, it doesn't mean that they're going to buy lumber. So I don't think there's a one-to-one connection on this. But I do think in consumption, so keep in mind, America's economy in the 19th century was not nearly as consumer-driven consumption as it is now. You know, we have a service economy that's mammoth, right? Well, they didn't have that like that, manufacturing, you know, and so it's not like, the thing about rich people, I remember hearing this about the guy who owned Nike. He was like, I can only buy so many shoes. As the CEO of Nike, I'm only going to wear so many shoes, right? But pay my employees more, they can buy more Nike. And that makes me more money. So the question becomes, it's an equilibrium issue, I'm sure. At some point, no employer is going to cut their own throat. But there's bound to be a situation, I don't think, but there's bound to be a situation where the argument goes, if these folks make more money. Now, usually today, you won't hear it on the employer, you'll hear it on the government. So what do they say? What do we hear usually today? Increase minimum wage. I don't know if that's going to work or not. Maybe. Hasn't been an increase in minimum wage in over 10 years. You know, and there have been other wage areas of same growth. I tend to believe, though, based on what I've studied about, for example, social assistance, like welfare, and for every dollar the government spends, $1.33 is created in the economy. So a ripple effect. So again, that's very macroeconomic, you know, in terms of all the variables that are affected. It's hard to say directly that employer is going to make money. But if you're making something that you're consuming, then you could, I mean, like I said, if you're Walmart, you're Hardee's, you know, you could argue, yeah, they're going to spend their money in the place they're getting paid. At Food Lion, we felt that way. Particularly if you do things like profit sharing, you know, which is like, if your company makes more money, you get more money. Like that should be another incentive to buy from that store. You have a family-owned business. If you eat, well, if you and your friends eat at your family-owned business, then theoretically that does better for the business. And if your dad pays you and then you just spend the money right back in, it's no loss for him. You know, so that's, keep in mind, these are a lot smaller scale economics back then. So today, since it's so big, we tend to see it more, what should the government do or not? And I'm a fan of that. I think, I'll show you about how wages have not really changed much in the last 40 years. You know, and that, I think, is really a burden on our economy. We need to make more money as a society to spend more money, you know, to create more work, you know, by spending more money. Because that's the catch. These guys, when every time they spend money, that's more job creation, you know, and thus more pay, more jobs. So the tighter a company gets, the less their employees have to spend money on. And in America, what are y'all spending your money on? That's the question. It's all everybody's question. You know what most Americans are spending their money on? Groceries. Well, that's good for the agricultural business, by and large. It's good for ConAgra and Cargill, all right? But we want you buying cars. We want you buying housing materials and construction. You know, we want you buying all the nice stuff American, and we don't want just buying Chinese-made televisions that are American branded. That's another reason why it's not really benefiting America. So, yeah, those are good questions, and you're going to routinely see them want more money, obviously. We're going to continue on with this topic now with one other subject, and that is a uniquely developed factory that becomes a sort of hallmark of a period of time that doesn't last very long. You had an American immigrant, another one of these British traders, who comes over. His name is Francis Lowell. He gets some support from another investor and a group of investors in Boston. They're called the Boston Associates. They want to build a model factory, a factory that is like good for its employees, if that makes sense. Not only that it pays them, but like that they're what they would want to be in. And so he gets some financing from a group called the Boston Associates. They don't settle in Boston. It's a little crowded there. They move up the Merrimack River, which is Massachusetts. And there they construct a mill on an existing waterfall, all right, and a power loom that Lowell has stole the idea from and developed a better version of, all right. And that new loom, in conjunction with that mill, is going to be very effective. But what makes this utopian mill, there's Lowell's mill, okay, his town, is that it's a planned community. Not socialist, but planned. So here's the Merrimack River, you see it? And what they do is they set up part of the river area for the factory. See the factories there? Then they have the housing for the workers. And so the whole plan is like laid out in advance. So they start from nothing, you know, from a blueprint basically, and build this town. Now, who will be their factory workers in the Lowell mill? There's his loom. They will be these ladies, the factory girls. So when I say ladies, they're Addie's age and younger. They're 14 and 15-year-old girls, okay? They are from the New England countryside. They are overtly recruited. So in other words, Lowell and his associates will go out in the countryside and say, hey, your young daughter is not of marriageable age yet. She is bored to tears and working in the countryside, barely surviving. We want her to come work at our factory. We'll pay her decent. We'll supervise her. And, you know, when she gets married, then she can leave. Okay? That kind of thing. So the Lowell mills were teenage girls from the countryside. Again, you know, from the Massachusetts countryside. You can see here. They would be supervised. They work 6 13-hour days. So that's a 78-hour work week, no overtime. They got up about 5 a.m. in the summer. Oh, no, 5 a.m. in the winter. I'll show you their bills. They went to church on Sunday, and they had socials where they got to meet single men. So it was like a dorm without college for factory working girls. Okay? They had a boarding house matron who checked the lights out and all that stuff. They had a very intense bell schedule. Okay, so here's the 4:30 in the morning bell, you know, and these bells signal lunch. So very much like our school. If you've ever heard someone say our education system is on the industrial model, this is the industrial model. This is what they're talking about, you know, bells and, you know, you guys sit out there and I'm up here. Yeah, so very, very similar to that. Here is their publication. Okay. Here's their song, one of the songs. I'm a factory girl, every day filled with fear. You know, tired for 38 hours and walk each day. I guess it should have been work. I'm a factory girl, you know. So it wasn't great, but it was supposed to be, and it was better than many of the other factories. And you would work here from the time you were 13 until usually you were about 17, 18, or 19, 5 years. And then you would have met a husband, and you would have gone and lived with him. At that point, and no longer been a part of the workforce. You would no longer be a worker bee. Unless you couldn't find a husband. And so that's where we get the phrase spinster. So if you were an old maid, a lady still working in the factory, you would be called a spinster, you know, somebody couldn't get married. And then you'd end up probably becoming one of those boarding moms, those matrons, you know, so kind of a tough gig. So your cultural mindset, and I hear it in young ladies sometimes in this county, this school out here, well, I hope to marry rich. as if that's the career objective, you know, like that's my professional ambition is to marry a rich guy. Well, that was kind of not that far off then. Okay, you wanted to meet Mr. Right, but you take Mr. Right now. So what happened was only about 10% of the women in America were working at this point. So they were usually these teenage girls. And then once you quit working as a teenage girl, you became this. So this becomes known as the cult of domesticity. Don't confuse this with Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood is the duty that women had in the Revolutionary era to raise virtuous sons, virtuous citizens. The cult of domesticity is the idea that what is the role of a woman? To be the mother and housekeeper. Very good. It's the future homemakers of America when I was a kid. FHA all the way. You know, it was your job is to take care of the house and hearth, the home. This is the very first, most clearly defined women's sphere in American history. It's not particularly good. Oh, all right, we'll finish up the chapter tomorrow. Have a good day. Thanks for playing.
Mr. Touart.
Oh, yeah.
I got a couple more questions for you.
Shoot.